Hi, my name is Savith. I've debated on the national team for the past 3 years. The motion today reads, assuming revenue neutrality, this House would abolish major taxes and replace it with increases in VAT. So there's an info slide for this motion, which is going to be linked below in the description. So let's jump into the case. I think, honestly, this is a much harder motion on prop than it is on op. It's just less intuitive. And I think because realistically no country's actually done this, that kind of indicates that it's not necessarily the most realistic policy. That being said, there's lots of ways in which you can make this policy sound more reasonable than it actually is. So that brings me to the first point of setup on proposition, which is to try and negate the opposition push that is quite obvious and easy to anticipate in this round, which is that an increase in the VAT is very regressive. And it hits people in the poorer sections of society a lot more because, they're essentially, if they're living paycheck to paycheck, all of their money is spent on consumption essentially, and all of their money is being taxed by that VAT, as opposed to people in the upper echelons of society who, maybe spend 10% of their income on consumption and are only paying tax on that 10% in this world. So one of the ways to mitigate this is the first point of setup, which is to say, essential services and goods will have a reduced rate of VAT taxation. So if you think things like rice and fuel, this is going to be taxed at a much lower rate than the broader basket of goods where we're going to actually raise the VAT to quite a high level. This is something that most countries already do, so it's a realistic policy. If you want, as a proposition team, you could potentially even say that you'd have a higher rate of VAT even above the normal basket of goods for things like luxury goods, trying to target the upper echelons of society even more. But again, there's issues with kind of running this. Perhaps you run into model quibbles, but I think it's probably fine. The second point of setup I want to run is just to clarify what kinds of taxes are being subsumed into the VAT tax on proposition. So this stuff is mostly in the info slide. But I think the clarification I want to add here is that taxes that are levied on demerit goods are probably not going to be affected by this motion. So if you're thinking taxes like cigarettes or taxes on goods like cigarettes, that's probably not going to be removed and then added into the VAT, because the purpose of a tax on cigarettes isn't to raise government revenue, but to disincentivize the use of cigarettes. So also on corporations that are polluting and stuff like that will be taxed higher. That's probably separate from this motion. And this is just to clarify and make sure that this doesn't become an issue later on in the debate. The final thing I want to add in setup for proposition is to kind of claim that the actual increase in the VAT isn't going to be really high, given that while it is a huge amount of money that you're trying to compensate with the VAT tax, it's spread over all of the consumption of the entire country. So realistically, it's not going to rise by 10-15%. Maybe it's closer to 3 to 5%. This isn't probably the most realistic statistic, but given that it is a debate where you're not being judged by an AI or something, you probably would do well to claim this on proposition. And it's likely buyable. At the very least, it becomes this kind of characterization quibble that probably gets written off. So I on proposition would say this. Okay, that being said, there's 3 main arguments I want to run on proposition. 2 of them are constructive and actually solve an issue. One of them is a responsive argument that is trying to essentially play defensively against the opposition claim that this is going to hit the poorest of society the hardest, and it's going to actually make it much harder for people to live because goods become so much more expensive. This isn't necessarily an argument. It's not doing anything positive for your case, but it is necessary to run it in first, which is why I would call it an argument and run it as such. So this is basically to say why having this VAT taxation actually lowers the base price of goods and isn't going to hit people to such a great extent. Again, this argument isn't something that you're hinging your case on, and you obviously can't win on this argument because it's just defending against the opposition pushers, but it is still necessary to run. So there's a couple of things you can say here. Firstly, when you remove corporate tax, you are lowering the cost of production on lots of goods, which then reduces how much they cost before any taxes are added anyway. So let's say you're making like, I don't know, pencils in a factory or something, there will be corporate tax on that pencil factory, which then raises the cost of the pencils for people. Now that corporate tax no longer exists, so you get that pencil for cheaper, even if the VAT is a little bit higher. So a lot of the taxes that we are replacing aren't actually going to increase the cost for the consumer. The second thing is that because the average person is going to be taxed less on their income or not taxed at all on their income, they have greater expendable income and therefore more purchasing power. So even if the goods are going to rise by like 2 to 3%, the fact that you have more money in your bank account means you can afford to buy those goods even if the VAT is higher. A final point, which is maybe a little bit more like nuanced and a little bit more of a stretch, is to say that there's going to be a huge amount of private sector growth, which we're going to prove in a separate argument, and explain as a result of that the public sector is probably going to contract, and that lowers the tax burden because the public sector is in part funded by taxes. And the fact that there's a lower tax burden means that you therefore need to make less money through the VAT in the first place. So again, this is not an argument that is going to win you the debate, but it is necessary to at least, muddy the waters a little bit in terms of the main opposition push. That being said, the main two arguments for proposition is firstly dealing with tax avoidance, which is the biggest thing and the most concrete claim that you can get on proposition, and secondly that you're improving the economy through like foreign investment, job creation, and things like this. So let's deal with the first constructive argument that we're going to focus on, which is dealing with tax avoidance. So the main thing that you want to explain here is that like when you have a lot of these direct taxes that are, there's a bunch of them and they're incredibly complicated, it does two things. One is that it makes it difficult for people to comply with these taxes even if they want to, because there's so many different taxes. Secondly, that because they are so complicated, it's really easy to avoid paying these taxes in the first place. So really rich people will use lots of legal loopholes. They'll, create shell companies. They'll, have offshore accounts where they're getting all of their money, sent to, which means that they're probably not going to even pay the majority of the tax that we're talking about in the first place. And that's trying to put opposition on the back foot and say, you simply cannot fund this economy with this kind of tax because the people who are expecting to pay this tax aren't actually paying it in the first place. Then you want to point out as well that it's not just about making people, hoping people pay this tax and, trying to remove the avoidance. It's also about checking up on these people. And it requires a huge amount of effort on the part of the government to actually chase down, these high tax-paying individuals or people who are supposed to pay a high amount of tax and actually tax them properly. The second thing that we want to talk about here is that you just basically explain why VAT is much better, right? It's taxed at every point, every transaction point where people are actually buying goods. It's essentially impossible to evade. And the only real thing that the rich people can do in this instance is just buy less stuff, which is probably a good opposition claim to make. But the point you're making here is like, if they're being taxed less on their income, if they're not being taxed in terms of their corporations and stuff like that, they're much more likely to just continue to live the lavish lifestyles they want to, and you can actually tax them on these major goods. Again, relying on that analysis and setup that this isn't going to be about essential goods in the first place. All right then, the second argument, which we'll talk about, is about how this improves the economy, improves the amount of private sector investment that happens. So this is also very simple. It's just explaining that when you eliminate income tax and corporate tax more specifically, it just makes it the country is much more attractive to foreign direct investment because it's just cheaper for foreign companies to set up shop here. That, drives the economy forward, and all the basic analysis that you run here in that it develops the infrastructure in the country, it employs a lot more people, all of these things you want to mention here. You also want to mention that businesses get to reinvest more of their profit because they have more profit back into the business, therefore developing these sorts of things. And that also improves the economy in the long term. So you want to point out that to some extent, right, you have to bite the bullet and say, lots of these improvements in terms of profit will benefit the capital owners, right? The people who own these companies. But eventually there will be labor market competition because there's like multiple of these companies setting up that eventually will raise the wages. People will have more money to spend. And then again, that tackles the whole rise in prices that people face. Another extraneous point that you can mention here is that when you eliminate income tax, it removes the disincentive for people to work additional hours or take higher paying jobs. Sometimes people might decide not to go for that higher paying job because the increase in income tax in that higher tax bracket might make it harder for them to justify it. That no longer happens. So people, are employed at a higher standard than they otherwise would be. Those are the general kinds of claims that you want to make on proposition. So I think in general, the idea in terms of strategy for a proposition is to try and muddy the water as much as possible in terms of this whole regressive problem and lean really heavily into the idea about tax avoidance and how you're much more likely to get compliance on the proposition side, because that's the biggest concrete benefit that you can make. And just say that, rich people essentially aren't paying taxes. This is the way to make them pay taxes. This is the way to fund the economy. And that makes it much better. Moving on to opposition then, I think we've talked about the main argument already, which is just that this is a fundamentally regressive policy, right? So to explain that in words, I guess, a bit more clearly, poor households who are paying, living paycheck to paycheck, they're spending nearly 100% of their income on consumption. And all of that is going to be taxed through the VAT, as opposed to wealthy households, which get to save and invest the majority of their income, which again makes them more and more money and therefore increases this inequality gap that you have. And maybe they'll spend 5 to 10% on consumption, and that will be taxed. And that means that the richest people aren't going to be really hit with it at all. Versus on our side, where you can have this kind of progressive taxation where you have higher tax brackets. So for people earning above 10 million, let's say, you charge them 40% income tax, for example. Now there's obvious issues with this. The avoidance thing is one of them, but you point out that this avoidance issue isn't a huge problem because you can try and avoid those loopholes themselves. You can try and fix the way in which tax collection is done, and that the increase in taxes you get from that policy itself will fund that improvement in tax collection. It's quite an easy thing to fiat, I think, on opposition. Although it is true that there still will be problems, and you have to deal with that main trade-off in that the proposition is likely to have a better collection system. So there's other arguments you can make here. The next one I would make is that there will likely be revenue instability as a result of the VAT, and that can result in public service cuts, which cripples the economy. So while the VAT is more stable in that it's easier to ensure that people are paying it as opposed to progressive taxation, it's based on consumption, and consumption is much more volatile than something like income. So if the country goes through a recession for whatever reason, that means government revenue falls very, very quickly, and that makes it very difficult for the government to do what they would normally want to do in that scenario, which is to, increase the do fiscal expansion policy essentially, and try and increase that kind of consumption. It makes it harder because there's less money that the government has now to actually do that in the first place. So that's another small argument that could be made. And just in general, you're pointing out that people might consume less altogether, right? So especially when we're talking about wealthy people, you could say that wealthy people just might buy less goods now that it's much more expensive to do so. And as a result, you lose all the trickle-down economics that you would usually expect. And that what makes it difficult to expand the economy and claim all the jobs and benefits that proposition wants to talk about. So I think broadly these are the arguments that I would make on each side. I think a thing to keep in mind in this debate for opposition in particular is that the argument about regressive taxation has less mechanisms than some of the stuff on proposition, but it is incredibly strong. It's the reason why this doesn't happen in the real world, and that's what I would focus on opposition. For proposition, the strongest argument to make is this tax avoidance and compliance argument, because it's just the most empirically true claim in this debate. So you focus heavily on that and try and mitigate as much as possible the regressive stuff. So that's the main trade-off in this debate. Yeah.